talk about local resource questions. So let's start with Zev. Um, you have the hat of also dealing with a lot of the contracts we have with sponsored research and things like that. So how does conflict of interest fit into that? And where, like the company's conflict, not just our conflict, but, and sort of like how is that managed? Like if somebody wants to do something, a company wants an investigator to do something. So how do we manage the conflict there?
So, unless it is tied to IP or something that we're familiar with that generates a conflict, it does not usually get flagged directly by us. So the
Mhm.
majority of sponsored research is not tied to licensed IP or to consulting. So it rarely comes up in the sponsored research agreements that we're managing. Where it does come up is, as I said, we will sometimes have, or we have licensed a portfolio of intellectual property, and not only do the company want to develop it itself, but they want to partner with the inventor who is the expert in that area to continue developing it in parallel here at CHOP. And as soon as we know that's going to happen is when we start to bring in Patrick, and Mia's group to start planning for that. But for, the majority of sponsored research agreements, they're not tagged by us.
Yeah, so that brings up a question of something that I learned recently, which was we're not concerned with our sponsors' conflicts. That's their problem to handle. So it's not, we're really talked about the conflicts that we have as an institution, as investigators. Can you speak a little bit to that? Because it was one of the questions I asked Patrick. I was like, wow, they want me, this company wants me to do something for them, but I think it's a conflict because if I recommend it, I'm going to recommend CHOP. And isn't that and he's like, that's their conflict to manage. So you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think, people might overplay, and they can always call you with any question, but they might overplay when they have to worry.
I'll 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 give this a shot. So I think that there are some things that I've seen that there's a perception that in a sense worry a little bit less about, but I want to be careful in saying that because as you identified correctly early in the slides, conflicts can come from all kinds of places. We primarily focus on those financial interests that people have. And that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. That's what the regulations require. It is not the only source of conflict. You can have you can run the risk of being biased either consciously or unconsciously just because you're sure the science is going to work. You've been doing it so long and you're still trying to push forward for it. So there's a lot of source of conflict that we really can't do anything to mitigate. We can do the best we can with the processes we have, but a lot of it comes down to the individual investigator to kind of, I think, be cautious about that. Um, but that being said, I think there are conceptions. We often have people put in their disclosures that they have research funded by, a certain company. So let's say that they've got Pfizer sponsored research in clinical trials. We don't consider that to be a personal interest. So, if because the money's really coming to CHOP and it's supporting your research and
That's
it's
the point I was
supporting other work
making.
that you do, but it's not. I kind of it's not that funny of a joke. But I always say like if you can't use the money to go to Disney World, it's not your money, and so we don't care about it. And I don't know if anybody likes Disney World anymore, but that's kind of the point. A lot of times investigators are surprised to hear that, and the reality is, if all of your research is funded by Pfizer, it's a little disingenuous to say you might not have any bias in their favor, but it isn't the type of interest that we consider to be a personal financial interest, which could give rise to a financial conflict of interest. Um, so if that answers the question, I think that's
It's a
probably
nuance I
the
think that people get confused about. That
agreed.
if you're getting grants or you're getting contracts and they're coming through CHOP, that's not a conflict of interest from the definition. But you should still be aware of it because you want to give credible advice. All right, so we're getting near
Can I
towards the
just
end.
make a
Oh,
really quick
yes.
comment on that one, Flora? Because
Yep.
I'm really glad you brought it up, and I agree with everything Patrick said. But let's not forget that if you're doing consulting for Pfizer, you've got
Yep.
a lot of research sponsored by Pfizer. Somebody in the press could conflate those two, and it could become a problem, even though under our rules and under the federal rules, you don't have to count that research that's sponsored. So, there's the rules and the processes, and then there's that extra stuff out there that can sometimes be a bugaboo. So you just need to have your eyes open about that and do the best you can to not create the perception that you are that biased person, that, you know, your science is what you're doing and you're doing it for the mission and all of that. But it is a tricky one because I think if you've got Pfizer all over everything in your division and your work, there is a risk, even though it's not something that we would manage.